Welcome, everyone. So welcome to the Learning Environments Australasian webinar, Why Choice is Important in Space. Before we begin, however, on behalf of the Learning Environments New South Wales chapter, we'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which we meet. I acknowledge that tonight I'm presenting to you from the Gadigal land in the Eora Nation, and we acknowledge the elders past and present and any First Nations people that may be present in our webinar tonight. Tonight, we are thrilled to have you join us for this evening's engaging session that explores the critical role in designing effective and inclusive learning environments. Today, we'll examine on how providing choice enhances student agency, motivation, and overall education outcomes, especially within the physical learning environment. We'll also hear about how integrating with our communities can benefit all learners of any age. Tonight, we are joined by speakers who bring a wealth of expertise in education, architecture, and learning design. They enjoy a global reputation and footprint from their work within learning-based research. We've got Dr. Wesley Imms, who is an esteemed researcher and educator in the field of learning environments. He's known for his work on the impact of design and spatial arrangements on student engagement and classroom dynamics. Wesley has contributed significantly to the understanding of how physical spaces influence teaching and learning practices, and he continues to advocate for evidence-based approaches to educational architecture. Dr. Wesley Imms is leading one of Australia's largest educational transformations of our time, with the reinvention of school space design and use. Billions of dollars are being invested in flexible learning environments that better match tasks to settings, thereby enabling teaching and learning that builds the wider skills that are demanded by today's knowledge economy. Dr. Wesley is an associate professor in the Melbourne Graduate School of Education. He co-directs the internationally recognised Learning Environments Applied Research Network, or LEARN, having secured over $15 million of grants and 67 industry research contracts worldwide. He is a prolific author and keynote speaker, and Dr. Wesley Imms works with educators and designers and policymakers to provide evidence on what works and when, and this is something he'll speak to you a bit further about. We're also privileged to be accompanied by Associate Professor Dr. Ben Cleveland. He is an educational researcher and consultant specialising in innovative learning environments and instructional design. His work focuses on creating flexible, student-centred spaces that foster creativity and collaboration. Ben's insight helps schools and institutions develop environments that respond to the diverse needs of learners, promoting a culture of education, choice and agency. Dr. Ben is an Associate Director of the Learning Environments Applied Research Network, or LEARN, at the University of Melbourne. He's the lead chief investigator for the ARC linkage project, Building Connections, Schools as Community Hubs, and the chief investigator on innovative learning environments and teacher change. Ben has led major evaluations for the Catholic Education Melbourne, Catholic Diocese of Parramatta, and the Victorian Department of Education and Training. He's influencing policy updates, and as a skilled educator and supervisor, he works and consults widely, including as the lead educational planner for 15 Victorian state schools and on projects across Australia and New Zealand. If there's ever a crew that I feel completely inadequate with, this is the crew we're here today. So today they'll be talking to you about the next steps in research and how they can connect you through their research to your day-to-day work. And we'll be looking forward to some stimulating discussion as we wrap up this evening. So to commence off, we'll pass over to Ben, who can start off with his presentation.
Thanks so much, Daniel. I think just quickly, Wes and I were going to just say a few words about the things that we wanted to cover. So Wes is trying to get his PowerPoint presentation working. I'm sure that will come along pretty soon. But he's going to talk more about evidence and how research can provide that sort of evidence to us and help us make informed decisions about learning environment design. But I want to take two particular angles at this issue of choice in school space. And that's related to diversity and inclusion of students with neurodivergent characteristics and also with disability, and also that angle of community use. So Wes, I think he might have dropped out to make sure his computer's working. Is that right? Yes.
Am I back again?
Yep. Are you back again, Wes? Did you want to say a few words of intro while I load up my slides?
Yeah, and I've just sent my slides through to you. Can you just check to see if they're there? My talk is going to be, again, more around the notion of evidence, and sort of the byline is evidence-based choice. And I really appreciate LEA sort of having this focus on this notion of making choices and why choices are important. And my take that I'm going to go into after Ben's finished is going to be saying that informed choice making is actually what over time has shown to be the most effective, and architects are in a position to really drive the notion of making choices based on not just anecdotally what works, but actually what proof exists that these things work. So that's where my focus will be in a few minutes. How are you going, Ben?
Now, as I've actually got your slides, and we had suggested that you might talk first because the arc of the narrative might work better. So
okay. Open it up.
I'll put them up. Well, let's assume it's going to work.
Yep. And I will just say change.
How about this? This is going to work.
Yep. And probably the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do a little push for 2 Learn events that are coming up in Fremantle. We'd love you to come across and join us. The first event is going to be a public research forum, which is looking at the ILESE project, but also further than that is going to be getting people together around the table to talk about what research does need to be done and how should we do it, and to get some tangible sort of outputs in terms of what grants can we go for. So that will be the first day, which is on the Wednesday. And on the Thursday and Friday, Talking Spaces 12. So we've done 12 of these, and they've always proved to be of interest. And we're really looking forward to this one because we've never been to the West before. Learn now has a hub over there. So the Learn Western Australia's Associate Professor Julia Morris is hosting this one. But it is around the notion of participatory design. And we've got 2 schools that we're going to, plus we're also walking around Fremantle choosing sites to go and to interrogate, and a whole bunch of hands-on activities, plus some really good keynote speakers. Alistair Blythe is coming across from the OECD or from University of Westminster, etc. So anyway, thanks, Ben. Next. Now I've done the little push. This notion of evidence-based choice. Next. Thank you. Look, the material I'm coming from, probably a good number of you would have already sort of been engaged with it. LEA was actually an active partner in the first 2 phases of this project, and you would have seen a number of you been to the workshops, etc. To put it into brevity, the first year was a scoping study with 250 experts from around the world working in workshops across about a year, and also a corresponding Delphi study that was run. Effectively asked the question of what research do we know, and what are the gaps, and where should we be doing the focus. You can see here the top 5 rankings overall from those 3 categories: academics, what they think; educators, what they think; and industry people, architects and other industry people, what they think. Evaluation of the learning environments was the highest ranked one overall. But then we've got affective learning outcomes. So, all those soft things you can't measure, like participation, engagement, etc. The design of ILEs was high. Obviously, industry put that as their number 1, etc. So these 5 priorities was what's driving our thinking at the moment within the group I work with in terms of where we should be going. And we've now been putting that into practice. Yeah, Ben, next one. And again, just to cut through, based on that year of exploratory work with this wide range of people across 19 countries, we came up with the the mandate to do the work that focuses on those 5 rankings, with a particular focus on this notion of evidence. The reality is we are constantly being faced, particularly in terms of governments saying, and you would have it from clients as well, here is a design. Where's the proof it actually works? Where's the evidence this actually works? And we have seen some pushback from state governments and others along the lines of, we need to go back to traditional classrooms, or we need to be less adventurous in terms of our design. This is not the time to be doing that, but without evidence, we can't really counter it. I mean, ironically, we now have, through the work that we've done and many others have done, more evidence that innovative learning environments are effective than there is evidence that traditional learning spaces are effective. And yet that falls on deaf ears because we need evidence. So our plan has been to build a database, a unique and unparalleled in scope database that puts together evidence around what does and doesn't work, with a particular focus on students and what students say is actually working, etc. Thanks, Ben.
Oh.
Next one, Ben. Yeah. So here's the scenario. I'm cutting through things fairly quickly, but it's this notion of choice. Okay, you're an architect and you're faced with a decision. You've got to make a choice about putting into place certain characteristics in the design that you're trying to sell to a school or to a government agency or whatever. And in this case, and keeping with the theme of today, I need evidence about which design characteristics have high levels of approval from students who experience limited physical mobility. Now, there is nowhere in the moment you can go to get that evidence. You might well start doing a literature search if you're an academic like Ben and I, but it puts you to sleep after about 5 minutes of going through articles, and you often have to read a whole article to get one kernel out of it. What we need actually is really direct information to answer just this question. So what could Argo tell us? Ben, next one. So the way Argo works is a bit like this, and please excuse my clumsy graphics. You're an architect working and you just don't know, what are the design characteristics that actually work best? What can where's the proof that actually this is a evidence-based choice? Next one. So you put in a request to Argo. Argo is an online database, but at the moment, So you put a request in and we put it through particular channels. Next one. We have the database and an analyst who sits and does the work trying to address the question you've come up with. Next one, Ben. From that, we generate reports that we think are specific to the particular question. Next one, Ben. Those reports then go back to the architect in this case. So they've actually got choices now. They can actually make choices on what they do based on this evidence. They can make an informed decision. And then, of course, that little arrow going down means off they go again and everyone's happy and it's a really good result. That's the theory. Next one, Ben. All of this was built through the ILSC project, and this is just an example of the groups. We ended up with over 100 institutions, architecture groups, whatever around the world, education departments putting into it, and across 19 countries. Next one, Ben. And here's the tool. This is actually the tool we developed, and we are now in the process of putting into place phase 3 of this project. It's made up, I won't go through it in depth, and some of you would already have heard this, but in effect, we map the school, we look at existing school data around attendance, we get those profiles, we look at external data like socioeconomic scales, school performance, those sorts of things. In the middle is the critical thing, is this is the tool that we developed, and it's the tool where we ask students to tell us what they think about the space and how it works. Thanks, Ben. Next one. So when you put that into practice, we built a tool. We've now trialled that tool in 12 different countries around the world. That it has proven that the tool is robust. It's gone through quite a complex confirmatory factor analysis, and we're very fortunate to have John Hattie working with us on this work, but also some highly skilled academics in health sciences, architecture and education. It is now a valid tool and we're ready to put it into large production. Now's the time to now go and populate it. The pilot study wasn't small. There was about 900 items, 900 responses went into it. So the pilot data is enough for us to get started on looking at how this works. But obviously phase 3 is where we now need to populate it with about 500 schools worth of data just to make it really robust. Next one, Ben. So this notion of I need evidence about which design characteristics have high levels of approval from students. If I've got particularly those students with limited physical mobility. Next one, Ben. Here's the model, and this is what Argo would give us. This is in theory what it would give us. Okay, Ben. Okay, then we know that we've got 15 schools in 10 countries with student ratings at or above 8 out of 10 in terms of accessibility. That's what Argo can tell us, really factual. The next one. And then actually interestingly, we've got 110 schools across 17 countries with low ratings. So this gives us really good comparative data. We can see not just, okay, these are the ones that work, but actually these are the ones that don't work. Next one. Of those highly rated schools, our modelling shows they consistently use the common design characteristics that would go in one of those attached reports. Next one, Ben. And it also shows modelling that 6 design characteristics are consistent with a lower rating. So Argo is able to say, you know, here's the evidence to show that these work, these characteristics work under this notion of mobility, and 6 don't, and these don't, these characteristics don't. Next one, Ben. And then we can provide correlations between this accessibility thing and a huge range of variables, and we'll look at that in just a minute. So in effect, that's the way Argo operates. Next one, Ben. And also contact. One of the things about Argo is gives us networking. So it's possible now for the architect to contact 3 schools or 5 architects and say, you did this, why, and what happens, etc., etc. Those architects clearly are from many of those different countries. Thanks, Ben. So this is the range of data that we would get. Ben, next one. So let's just look at it a little bit more practically. I'm a principal and I'm trying to decide, our school is trying to decide if students with disabilities and neurological issues prefer learning in ILEs compared to traditional spaces. You would say that's a fairly simple question, yet again, it's just not possible to get that answer from data that exists at the moment, other than a few select studies. Next one, Ben. So how can Argo help us? This is material that's now going to be presented at the Architecture, Building and Planning Forum, scheduled in Melbourne for November, I think, Ben, but you'll, I hope, talk about that in a minute.
I will.
And this is the data from that. So effectively, here's the raw data put through the first layer of analysis, and it looks a bunch of histograms, which are very interesting. One on the left is traditional learning spaces. The one on the right is innovative learning spaces. Very quickly, what does it tell us? Thanks, Ben. Next. Look, in summary, at the biggest possible picture, overall disabled students rated there, and this is real life data now, in the pilot study, disabled students rated their participation lower than their peers across the board. Now, it's probably not surprising, but on the other hand, it does show we've got a problem. We have to somehow get disabled people more engaged, kids more engaged in their schooling, closer to their peers. The participation scores are closest to each other in ILE. So while there remains a difference between the two, as you can see from histograms, the difference between them is much less within an ILE. In other words, ILEs are helping students to participate at a closer rate to their peers. We'd love it to be equal, but that's what the data is showing at the moment. So there's straight away is a fairly comprehensive statement to be able to make. You know, this is the reason why you need to move away from the more traditional designs and into more innovative, based on just this data about student participation, students with disability in their participation. Next one, Ben. So the thing though with Argo is you then go back to it and you'll say, all right, then that's very interesting. So students with difficulties do have their best chance in ILE rather than the traditional space. But looking at that data, what are the design characteristics of the spaces that seem to better suit students with disabilities? So now we're getting to another layer of information, and it's here where you can tailor more and more and more your requests. Next one, Ben. This is just a rough mapping of the character of the variables that are within Argo, and given the correlation analysis design of it and the sophistication of the package, you're able to correlate any of these with any other. And here, what I've said is, okay, then, walking and movement impairment. What are the design characteristics that are consistent, high and low, with kids in their movement around spaces, school, etc.? And you see I've actually outlined spaces at the top, which means all of those characteristics down there will be used one-on-one to do correlations, so we can tell, okay, what about humidity and temperature? Does that make a difference to how disabled kids move around the spaces compared to their peers? Or it might be the windows, or it might be the furniture variety, it might be the square meterage of the school and the spaces, etc. It enables you to be able to tailor evidence so the choice you make can be highly informed. Next one, Ben. And you can imagine, and these, we won't go into these, but these are just the types of things it can do. You know, architects are important people, but so are people who make furniture. cost effectiveness. We wanted to which types of furniture best meet a wide range of ages, and we can put that into Argo and come up with some raw data or some evidence that would answer that question. Next one, Ben. Acoustics firm. Our study needs a sample, so academics can actually use it to gather baseline data to be able to go deeper into particular issues. Sorry, I'm just looking ahead at the slides. Yes, I think I've just doubled up, Ben. So we'll finish it on that slide. I suppose the point I'm making, which I hope I've made fairly clearly, is choices are marvellous, but we do need to actually have some systematic decision making and what choices are available to us. And evidence, I would argue, is the place to go to be able to help to drive that information. So it'd be lovely if you joined the Architecture Forum in November, or if you can come to Perth and have a weekend over there as well, and come and join the 2 events that are running over there. Ben, I'll hand over to you. Thank you for such a good job of flicking through the slides.
Thanks, Wes. I felt very useful. I wonder if Daniel wants to chip in and say anything in between.
I was on mute, so I didn't cause any issue. I guess one of the things that was just coming to mind, Wes, is obviously we've got a lot of data, we've got a lot of choices, and obviously a lot of the things which Argo is aiming to do is to make it a little bit more informed and factual. And I guess if I can put you on notice with a random question, such as, what are the common choices that you see being made, for instance, with ILEs or even just learning environments broadly, that perhaps are a little bit of a misconception in the industry?
Okay, it's on notice, is it? Can we think about it, or do you want an answer now?
Up to you. If you need to, you might also need to run it through Argo. You never know.
That's correct. But I mean, certainly Ben would have an opinion on this as well. The common misconceptions, etc. I think one of the things is that one of the common misconceptions is you either have open plan or you have traditional, and the reality is we understand through the work that you guys are doing that there is an enormous range of hybrids in between. And certainly our evidence shows that actually it's those hybrids in between that are most effective. Traditional don't work very well, and open plan, while better, still don't work fantastically. So that's one misconception that people do. The other one is that that you can take a cookie cutter approach to stuff. You can actually have one design and put it into 5 different environments, and it's going to be just as effective on each, because after all, good teachers can teach anywhere, that sort of mantra. Whereas again, Argo, but not just Argo, all of the evidence that we've built and others have built around the world shows that actually you can have 2 schools side by side and be absolutely identical in how they are designed, but actually how they're used makes a huge difference in terms of their outputs. So I mean that's just off the cuff. Yeah.
I guess that kind of links back to I guess one of the earlier research programs that you were running with the ILSC, so program to sort of engage like how do you actually use these spaces and whatnot. But I guess another question, if I may, obviously I'm an architect, and that's, I'm not an academic and I'm not an educator, although I like to say that I'm an education specialist. So I guess what I'm alluding to is Argo, I think, could be quite a powerful tool, and certainly in the hands in the broad masses. So how do you make research palatable, I guess, for a non-academic, as an example?
I think Argo is an example of doing that really well. We must remember Argo, as it stands, is just a database. That's all it is. It doesn't actually come up with answers. That puts the onus on the users, the principals, the academics, the designers, the architects, to actually make decisions based on the evidence, which is what you've always done. And obviously, because of the development of learning environments across the last decade, you're doing it well as designers. And I think as educators, we're sort of trying to keep up. But that's all Argo can do, is give evidence. Ultimately, it comes down to you with your team sitting in a room and saying, we think this school wants this. Therefore, this is probably what we should give them, but let's at least put an evidence base to it. Let's back up what we're drawing with here are some basic facts, that we've shown that X, Y, and Z and these spaces work more often, well, with that particular cohort, it's the same as yours, as blah, blah. That sort of evidence can be done. And that's just basic good thinking, which you do anyway, but now you've actually got another tool to add to that.
Yeah. I guess when I sort of take that broad view across Australia and New Zealand, where countries that have access to substantial amounts of resources to get this stuff right, it's then the how we actually do that to be intentional, but as you say, evidence-based in that. And I guess if I leave with one little comment, I remember being a talk some years ago with the question, what would Hattie do? And I wonder whether that now gets reframed, what would Argo do? Pass it over to Ben.
Not what would Argo do, what would Argo say? Yeah, like the TV show.
Yeah, there you are.
Although I must admit, Daniel, I can see that Derek's got his hand up and I wouldn't want to leave him hanging for too long.
Oh, no, poor Derek. He needs a shot.
Yeah, I was just about to ask a question later on, but there was a great segue there, guys, in terms of the variables that Argo looks at. If I was to ask Argo and say, and ask Argo to actually, after it's analysed a number of spaces within schools, etc., to be able to tell me what variables are lacking to enable that space to be successful, because we know that in some of those hybrids, if there's not effective teacher collaboration, it's not going to work. If there's not the right change mindset, it's not going to work. If there's not contemporary pedagogies, or if there's not the right mindset. So I would guess that Argo is going to have enough intelligence to be able to provide for a school the ability to identify what variables are missing. So they don't lean as the primary aspect of the space. They lean on the fact was that is actually successful. It's we're not actually enabling rich teacher collaboration or contemporary pedagogies. What do you think, guys?
I mean, I guess that's exactly right. So you could go to Argo and say, all right, then, this is our socioeconomic ranking for this school. It's a single-sex school. It's based in a rural area, blah, blah, blah. Put all those variables in and you say which spaces actually are working best according to this and this. And then that would give you rankings. And then you would look at those and say, well, which of these are we not addressing? Because those schools, actually, the ones that are doing well, arguably will have characteristics that are similar. And you would look and say, but our design doesn't have that. So therefore, we need to look at that as being the missing link, so to speak. Yeah. Again, though, it's what you just said then, though, is the saving grace of something like Argo. It is just a database and it has to actually be used well, which means thinking. And that's what your teams do well, but it gives you that database to be able to, what about this and what about that? Okay, take that away and do this with the data instead. What happens? Yeah.
Thanks.
All right, I'll get my slides running. Is that time for that, Daniel?
Over to you.
Let me see if I can get this to work. Yet again. Click one more time. How's that? Is that visible?
Yep, it's working.
It's all good.
Terrific. All right. Well, I'm going to take a slightly different angle than Wes, a little less data driven and a little more qualitative, as us academics would say. This issue of choice in space, I thought tackling that from two angles, which have been very close to our research program in Learn over the last few years. One, looking at choice in space through the lens of neurodiversity and disability, and the other looking at it through community use of school facilities. Both of these groups obviously bringing particular requirements that might be outside the sort of the normative student and teacher requirements, and helping us hopefully think about thinking about broader population characteristics and how we need to accommodate all of these things in our schools as really important social infrastructure. But I wanted to start slightly theoretically, just think about people in space and how can we think about those relations. So one of the questions that I often ask early if I'm involved in a design project myself is, pop a few images up and ask the people a very simple question of what's possible in this space. So I won't actually ask the question, but if you have a quick look here thinking, well, what could we possibly do there? But my second question here is, what if you come with particular additional or special needs? What can you therefore do in a space like this? And that's a very different question from asking it of yourself or of what you might call the normative student or teacher. What about if you're also a community member who might use these facilities outside of hours? And what sort of responses might you provide in that context? Asking the same question of a slightly different space, you might have noticed in the first one there was a lot of furniture on wheels and so on. There was a lot of configurable options. But in a space like this, when you've got a lot of fixed joinery, what's possible here? But also you've got a wider variety of spatial options. You've got a nice little meeting room up the back, a nice little nook. You've got probably what looks like a teacher work area that's got some adjacency to a common space. And you've got obviously this more sort of socially oriented meeting and teaching and learning area. So again, different affordances of these environments. And I guess that word affordance is the one I was trying to get to here. Many people will know Fiona Young, and that she did her PhD with us a few years ago and had a strong focus on trying to understand the situation of affordance theory in the world of learning environments. And that's been a very, very useful piece of work. And I think, when we're thinking about school space and choice, affordance theory really can help us think about that a bit more carefully. For those not familiar with that idea of James Gibson, it's basically thinking about what are the action possibilities or, the possibilities of a learning space that may result from the relationships between the user and the environment. And it's worth noting that affordance theory is not a theory of space, it's a theory of perception and how we perceive what's possible in our environments. So it's more of a psychological construct than a spatial construct. But you can bring it quite quickly into space and you can ask questions about spaces. Fiona and I and others, indeed Wes, defined learning environment affordances in that work, and we talked about the qualities of the environment, including the people, the spaces, the objects, the people, which enable those perceived teaching and learning behaviours and activities. And I guess coming back to this idea that we've got lots of different users of our environments, we need to think about that really carefully when we're developing our projects. So, one of the things that we're arguing for in Learn and through the work that we've done is this idea of affordance-based design. That is thinking about the perceived requirements of different learners, different stakeholders. Obviously, architects, teachers and students come with different ideas. And then we've got lots of other different stakeholders as well. We talked about the community members. We talked about the fact that student and teacher populations are very diverse. We've got others as well. And so I guess our argument here is that we need to be bringing all of those ideas into a shared repertoire and a shared understanding of what's required in our schools. There is a whole lot of academic work that, Wes said it was boring and there's only little kernels having read a whole article, but I reckon there's a few kernels in some of these articles. And so they are things that are available, some of them free of charge on different publishing websites. But ultimately, it really comes back to this idea of experience and whose experiences are we talking about. We're thinking about what relationships might have an impact on that experience, the activities, the time of day, but I guess really importantly in this context, the environment as well. So if we're thinking about affordance-based design, the thing that I would suggest people don't start with is asking questions about what types of spaces you'd want, because you completely miss the point. And I would suggest that only asking that as a general guide should be the approach. More importantly, asking about what people want to be able to do in their environments and thinking about that as the avenue for gaining understanding of what affordances do people want in their environments, and therefore how should the environment be designed to provide those. If it's a learning space, people might respond that they want to communicate some learning intentions, they might want to demonstrate some skills, they might want to somehow support students' agency in their self-regulated learning, enable one-on-one interactions, the list goes on, check for understanding, foster group discussions, make learning visible. All of these things are the kinds of things that you might get feedback on if you were to ask people through an affordance-based design approach. Make provide a sense of belonging also being really important. But then again, you're only asking select groups. So what might others want to do in that environment as well? And that's where I think sometimes we get a little bit siloed in our approach to school design, where we're thinking about only those most significant users of those spaces. And obviously, teachers and students are really, really important and the most critical users of those environments. But there are other users as well, and we really need to make sure that we're talking to them, as well as those people who are the most common users of our spaces. As Wes said, Talking Spaces in Fremantle in early October, we'll focus on this idea of participatory design or co-design or participatory briefing. There's lots of different sort of nuances to this. But really, this is about trying to drill into what it is that people really want to have available in their environments. So again, some suggestions for sort of some high-level questions. How should your school be socially organised? What curriculum will be taught, and therefore what types of spaces do you need to support that? What does good teaching learning actually look like? What are the pedagogies that are going to support the learning outcomes that are desired? How can staff be able to work effectively together? And then we start getting into some of the things that we've been talking about, and Wes was talking about also. How can students' inclusion, wellbeing and pastoral care be supported? And so those wellbeing discussions being increasingly prominent and important as we go through over time. And how can facilities aid school community relations and community use? So again, just broadening those conversations beyond some of the things that perhaps we find as normal in our work thinking about school design. So really, we do need to be looking ahead. As Wes said, particularly those disability inclusion issues, in a lot of ways, the inclusion policies have gone in advance of, I think, probably where we've been responding to in the built environment. And we're in a situation where we're playing somewhat playing catch up, particularly in the mainstream school system, which should be more accessible and supportive of the participation of more people. So some years ago, and we're talking about 5, this became a sort of priority. Argo confirmed that this was absolutely necessary, but we'd already started that work, but based on less data, but conversations that were clearly pointing that direction. So we've been looking at designing for neurodiversity and disability for a few years, as I said. We're thinking about, the fundamentals which building codes tend to address reasonably well about physical access. But more importantly, I think we've been thinking a lot more about the sensory environment and also about physical and emotional well-being, and that being precursors to any learning occurring. So, students with disabilities, they need inclusive buildings, and it's really important that we work as hard as we can to make sure that becomes the reality. But there are lots of examples out there where some of these things are happening well, and the databases like Argo are picking those things up. One of the things that often is spoken of at all different contexts is that universal design will solve all these issues for us, and that we're talking about them already. I guess our position, having worked with a lot of the universal design principles in lots of projects, is that they're a great practical tool for aspiration, but they're not providing us with data that is specific to the needs of learning spaces. They're principles, they're really useful, they provide moral sort of guidance, but again, we need more evidence about how different design characteristics can support the inclusion of kids who've got additional needs. So we started some of that work, as I said, a few years ago. Shout out to Melbourne Archdiocese Catholic Schools who funded a project related to some of their schools about 4 or 5 years ago. We've also had seed funding from the Melbourne Disability Institute to do a seed project, which has led now to a much bigger ARC linkage project, which is this one, Designing Learning Spaces for Diversity, Inclusion and Participation. We started this project last year and we're about a year into it. And so we don't have a lot of findings that we can share with people just yet, but that will start to happen over the next sort of 6 months and through the next couple of years that follow. It's a really big project. It's got lots of partners, the governments in Victoria, South Australia and Queensland, bunch of really wonderful architects who you'll all probably be familiar with. Importantly, some disability representative organisations, Association for Children with Disability, Heads Together for Acquired Brain Injury. MTA, who you'll all know as well, have been supporting this too. And the University of Adelaide came on because one of our researchers moved there from the University of Melbourne last year, and Bond University is involved as well. So we've got a Queensland base also. We're asking, or we're trying to find out something pretty straightforward, or at least on the surface. The project's trying to investigate how to build mainstream schools to make it easier for students with disabilities to participate. Obviously, with most research, as you would probably be aware, starting in the literature. We did this before we even applied for this project, but the literature tells us some things. But I guess our reading of that is that it's a very, very thin academic field, and there's a lot of work to be done. We're doing a scoping review to really do an exhaustive search of the literature at the moment, and that's almost complete. But about 3 years ago, we wrote another review of what we'd read in the literature as well, and Scott Alterator, who was working with us now at La Trobe University, was instrumental to that work as well. Some of the things that come up include issues about environmental performance, obviously physical access, acoustics, visual access, safety is really important. And then a whole range of other sensory factors about layouts, transitions, thresholds between indoors and outdoors, between different spaces interiorly, thoroughfares choices, materiality, complexity. There are a whole range of things that are going on here. But in terms of information about how these things work or don't work, this is really lacking. So our project's trying to fill some of these gaps about how you can address some of these issues with a lot more certainty. At the bottom there, it talks about participatory design and lived experience, and I think this is one of the main sources of information which is not accessed by the design industry, and that is bringing people, and I'll talk about this in a few minutes as well, because I do have a slide, but I'll get in ahead of the slide, bringing people with disability and neurodivergent conditions to the table, to have their say and to hear from them directly about what it is that would be more supportive of a better lived experience in our school environments as well. This, the title of that project about diversity, inclusion, participation is not an accident. We're really sort of seeing that the title is reflecting diversity as a growing appreciation for the fact that populations have, very distributed characteristics, and that we need to be welcoming and supportive of more people. Inclusivity being about a growing aspiration to respond better to that diversity. But through the work of Wes's wonderful wife, Christine Imms, who's written a lot about this construct of participation, we've come to understand that this idea of participation being about access and meaningful involvement in a situation helps us really tap into the lived experiences of people, and to understand how we can provide better access and better meaningful better meaningful involvement in a situation in schools. And so participation is really the key construct that's driving the work that we're doing. I want to fast forward a little bit. The work we've been doing with Max, the Melbourne Archdiocese, actually involved building buildings, and this is the reason the project's taken such an incredibly long time. We worked with some architects. You can see Hayball's name at the bottom there, who just happened to be working for Max at the right time, and had a primary school project that had a principal and some other middle leaders who were very keen on the idea of creating better and more supportive learning environments for students with neurodiverse and disability conditions. And I thought I'd share this because I think this is quite interesting. This is only a small portion of a new learning building, the ground floor of a 2-story building. But one of the constructs we came up with when, and I'll fast forward, when we brought a whole lot of people around the table who are not normally introduced to these kinds of design projects. We had speech pathologists, we had occupational therapists, the learning support officers who work with kids one-on-one and in small groups, the staff, we had parents. We had 1 or 2 students who contributed in bits and in sort of fits and starts when they could, but a group of people who provided incredible insight into what it's like for students with additional needs to be at school and how we can better support their participation in those environments. And one of the constructs that came out of that work was this idea of having a sort of a three-part typology to creating choice in the environment. So yes, this school does have classrooms, well, things that you can close down to become classrooms is probably more specific. So you can see that the home base is enclosable. There are some quite large operable walls or operable doors, sliding doors that you can close down to create a classroom. But within the classroom, there are also options to be aside, to retreat, to provide a place of comfort or a place of regulation. Then just beyond the classroom, this is a very efficient building. There's no sort of big learning commons, that there are discrete and small group areas for students to work either on their own or in small groups with support of learning support officers or other teachers. And so that, again, providing options and providing choice. And then the third one being more dedicated spaces for, labelled here as chill out or co-lab, but these are actually become, the school's now calling them sensory rooms, places for children who can spend 10 or 15 minutes outside their classroom when they're overwhelmed. Some of these kids who are actually at this school have programmed within their day 2 or 3 visits to those spaces to make sure that their regulatory condition is, within the boundaries of them not, completely losing the plot and finding school totally overwhelming. So some of these things we've started to not only talk about, but embed in new buildings. And we've had the chance to evaluate this one, and I'm just writing up the findings, and it's been very, very encouraging. I can say that the school is very happy with the situation, and that their old buildings, which didn't have all of these affordances, they found, and they're continuing to find it, and will be adapting them to create a more stable environment in terms of the consistency with which they can regulate kids across the cohort and provide a calmer environment for everybody. So I talked about the who's at the table. Obviously, critical insights, from learners, parents, carers, educators, system leaders, allied health professionals. I talked about some of those. But I suppose my point here is to bring a lot more people to the table that haven't had the input that we traditionally allow. Now, I'm probably going a bit over time here, Daniel, but I'll really quickly just whip through my other point, which is about those additional users from the community. So we did this other project. It's finished a few years ago. There's lots of outputs on the Learn website, Building Connections, Schools, Community Hubs. Again, thanks to some of the state governments there and some of the architects who've been on numbers of projects with us over the years. Trying to understand how schools can act as more like community support platforms. And it's surprising how quickly this idea is being taken up. There are some great historic precedents like this one, which is the Corinne Family and Community Centre in Corio in Geelong, which is plugged into Northern Bay College. This is a place which is really probably one of the flagships. It has child and maternal health services, play groups, toy libraries, community facilities for all sorts of local community groups. It even has a visiting specialist space for people who are in the local prison to have visitation with their children. So we're talking about some really quite specialist spaces as well. But a lot of really interesting things going in this space, and recognising that the central role of schools in community and how that can be leveraged to create better conditions and better environments for the social cohesion and the resilience of communities beyond just educating students. Now, I do have too many slides for this, so I'm probably going to have to skip quite a few, but we did a national survey and we had more than 400 replies to that survey from across the country. It was a very long survey, but I think this probably is some of the more interesting, readily digestible data that came out of it. So we asked schools about what types of services or programs that they supported through their shared use and or specialist facilities. 62% of them said that they hosted community events or services. 20% of them said that they hosted health services. 11% adult education. 22% had some form of early childhood education happening on site. And not surprisingly, a vast majority of 72% said that outside school hours, they hosted sports and recreation activities. So even from this small snapshot, you can see that, school environments are being used by outside users beyond those core students from prep to year 12. And so if we're thinking about them, we're thinking about this use, then we need to be thinking a lot more carefully about how we can program schools to do these things. I'll flick through a few more slides. I guess I'll skip to some of the outputs of the project that people can have a look at. One of the things we wanted to do through the project was make visible where these things are happening and what's happened already. So we held an exhibition as part of the project, and we also captured that outputs of that exhibition in this Sharing Schools Building Communities ebook, again available on the website. It showcases, things like at Armidale Secondary College, where the intercultural issues were really important, and they've created a whole range of indoor and outdoor spaces for intercultural events. Beaumaris Secondary College has developed relationships with sporting associations, developed some wonderful sports facilities. Bridgewood Primary has some fantastic early learning and child and maternal health facilities on site, as does Carlton Learning Precinct, which is not too far from our university, including one of Australia's best covered outdoor learning areas, designed by the wonderful Sandy Law, which has become a precedent for lots of others that are popping up around Melbourne as well. I'll finish with this. This is really aspirational. This is a wonderful project we came across in Denmark, and I think we're not up to this here yet in Australia, but things could change quickly if things continue in the right trajectory. The Heart Project in ICAST, which is part of the International School of ICAST brand, is a building or a whole facility which was programmed to be both a school and a community facility in one. Not one or the other or a school plus, but one and the same. And as you can see through some of these photos, as I think through, the architecture is pretty beautiful as well. Some of the outdoor amenity, the futsal court, the beach volleyball, the skate park, all of these things for school use and community use for young people and older people as well. Indoor sports facilities also. And by day and so on, it is a school. But in the evenings and weekends, it transforms very, very readily into becoming a place for community events, choir performances, cultural exchange experiences. The spaces the students use are used for, swing dancing by the local community in the evenings, and other sort of soirees and so on. So, some of these projects that are happening in other parts of the world, I think we can still be looking at, particularly in Northern Europe, for evidence about how the spend on the infrastructure is really maximising the benefits, not only for education, but for the wider community as well. Some of the other outputs, there's the book, which is freely available online, open access. The How to Hub Australia guide, which is the sort of the distillation of the book into 43 pages, is available as well. And if you're really interested in taking a community hub angle, we think our journey map can help drive some conversations. So that's available too. I'll finish because I've spoken for way too long. Wes mentioned the ILESE project and the Talking Spaces event, but we've also got a really big event in November here at the University of Melbourne. It's the annual Architecture, Building and Planning Symposium. Our group won the rights to host that this year, and we're hosting a two-day event about designing learning spaces for diversity and disability. Day one has about 40 different industry and research groups presenting the research they've done from Australia and around the world. And day two is a big public forum to sort of share the love and share the insights from wonderful experts, including the very, very wonderful Magna Mustafa, who is the world expert on designing for autism for schools and other learning spaces, who's joining us from Cairo. So we're really looking forward to her coming. Thanks for letting me talk for so long, Daniel. I'll stop.
You're very welcome, Ben. Thank you very much for that presentation. I think one of the things I just wanted to sort of jump in there, just to sort of embellish a little bit, if I can link back to a workshop that you ran for our Christchurch conference, I think it was back in 24. I guess linking back to universal design, but also, I guess, universal design process. it's not just about including people, but it's how you ask the question as an example. I just wondered if you maybe wanted to go through some of those key points that we might want to consider while you've got a bunch of architects in the room as to not just the considerations, because I think your presentation is very clear in terms of the benefit for designing for, I guess, neurodiversity, designing for people with different, living with different, I guess, abilities, is really designing for everyone and enabling that through all sorts of, I guess, changes in our life cycle. But how do we ask the questions that might be perhaps a bit more impactful?
It's a really good question, Daniel. And to be honest, it's part of our research program is to investigate exactly that. How do you bring people productively, into these conversations? One of the strands of the current ARC project is about co-design and the use of mixed reality to bring emerging designs to people, who do have disability. They're lay people. They're not designers. We're in the early days of trying to understand how we can do that. So I don't have all the answers, but we do have the ambition to provide the answers over the next 2 years. We have a PhD student who's particularly focused on co-design with people with additional needs. And so that work we think is going to be really central to providing, I guess, insight to the industry about how you can do that productively. And we also recognise efficiently, because it's not necessarily the case that the design process is going to be elongated, exponentially to allow all of these things to happen. People still have to charge fees. There's still going to be government expectations about, how long projects should take. Maybe we can stretch those a bit. That would be very helpful. But if we're going to create really good solutions, we need to have the time and the know-how about how to bring all of these people to the table and work with them in ways that provide the insight needed.
Yeah, it's the time and the investment in the process that comes together. Yields the benefit.
There will be some complications, but if we can provide guidance and open people's eyes to how they can do it, that's our objective.
I guess, like anything, change can be a bit confronting to begin with, but once you understand it and you build an understanding, you can sort of navigate your way a bit more gently through that.
That's right. And I think we also have to build confidence that, that we can do these things. So we're trying to provide people with starting points and advice on how they can do that. Yeah,
and you start where you start. You don't always start with a basis of, I guess, complete understanding. Everyone starts wherever they happen to be, and that's okay. I guess one of the points that you're making during your presentation was kind of, I guess, the links to well-being. And I guess one of the questions I wanted to ask you was, what's the biggest tangible issues, I guess, around well-being in space that is worth considering, I guess, while we're designing learning environments?
Well, I go back to some of the things I discussed. I think we're only more recently recognising how much sensory overload a lot of children experience in our learning spaces. And I think this alludes to some of the things that Wes talked about, classrooms don't necessarily work. It's kind of like, Homer Simpson going for the donuts and getting electrocuted all the time. You just keep going back for more, but actually more isn't what you need. I think increasingly we're understanding that, kids do have sensory needs, and that really busy, loud environments is just something that they have a lot of trouble coping with. And, children will be labelled as the kids with the behavioural problems. But if we step back and take a social model of disability and we say, well, yes, they might have some particular sensory needs, but actually it's the environment that we're putting them in where those things are being expressed. And without that sensory overload, they're probably much more able to access the learning and to be regulated throughout the day and to participate in much more effective and generous ways that also aren't stressing out those who are trying to support them. So, some of these things are really complicated to talk about, and sometimes you end up stepping on toes that you don't wish to. But I think they're conversations we all need to be having. And I suppose, earlier evaluation work that we've done has really highlighted this idea that, variety and choice in the environment is really important. because we've got a whole lot of people who have got a whole lot of different requirements, and you've got to be able to offer them different experiences in different settings at different times. Similar to the example I showed of the new Catholic primary school environment. Yeah,
which is marvellous. And I remember a number of years ago, I had the benefit of touring a school in southern New South Wales, and it was interesting to understand, I guess, the school's lack of empathy of some of that sensory input, I guess, within the space. And this is where I kind of had the idea, I've got to buy myself a learnometer as an example, because I've got to replace assumptions with fact. And I think that's really where your work at Learn really becomes so important. We've got to stop assuming, and we've got to build a bit of empathy for other people along with that. And I think that's when we can take some of that good work and then sort of combine that, I guess, with your work with schools as community hubs as an example. And isn't it good that we've actually got a whole bunch of facilities that actually could unite people and bring them together, whether it be for lifelong learning or just being together as a community? I tend to think particularly the opportunities around developing or new communities as an example, where we don't have that stickiness that binds us together yet. You know, we might be going through mortgage stress and you might be learning how to be a parent, but you don't have that support network around you. And really, this is how we can bring people together to unite. We are always stronger as a community.
I think if I can, Dan, one of the really interesting things about Denmark is that the local municipalities, of which there are about 97, that's my understanding, they are responsible for all of the social infrastructure in their municipality. So it includes the schools and all the community facilities. So in terms of governance structures, it makes a lot of sense for them to be, you know, extending the dollars that are available to build facilities that have multiple use. And so it happens. This also happens more so in the ACT than it does in any other parts of Australia. Because again, they've only got the two levels of government, and so that they tend to share a lot more. And so you'll find in their school projects that they have early learning centres almost ubiquitously in every new project.
Makes sense.
Yeah, so it makes sense, but we separate these things because we've got different governance structures. You know, 3 levels of government across most of Australia. Local government supplies some things, state government supplies the other things, federal government pours in a bit of money from time to time. But there are structural issues at play that are hard to overcome. But we need to keep working on that.
Indeed, indeed. So perhaps if obviously we're running a little bit over time, but does anyone want to ask any questions for the panel? This is where it goes deathly silent.
While people are thinking there, Daniel, could I get you three to just smile as I take a quick snapshot? Here we go for our Learning Environments Australasia marketing. 3, 2, 1, smile. Nice, thank you.
So Derek Partel's classic. I tend to think it's probably worth, I think, advocating in the future around how we leverage some of this dual use, I guess, for schools and community hubs. And I think that potentially when you look at the statistics around Australia, on average, if you round it, it's about 60%, I guess, public schools and 40% non-government, in which case, if we're giving capital grants out, potentially it's worth considering advocating through some of those chains that it becomes a condition of the funding, something to help direct and encourage some of those outcomes. The world's a better place if we work together.
Well, one of the huge opportunities, which I was going to mention but haven't, is the Building Early Education Fund, actually known as BEEF, which is coming out. So it's $1 billion for early years facilities coming out of the federal government. And there is acknowledgement within that, you know, the group running that and at some of the philanthropic advocacy groups, including Bryan Foundation and the Ramsay Foundation, who are all very supportive of that idea of particularly early years and family-oriented facilities on school sites, so that funding doesn't just go purely into early years education, but it goes into early years education and, you know, some of those community facilities which can be so supportive of that community resilience.
Indeed, indeed. Well, given that we don't have any other questions, we might look to wrap up there. So a real big thank you, Wes and Ben, for your presentations. And I have to say, as an interested observer, keep going. We've got more work to do. And I think, if anything, my personal opinion is we often sort of poo-poo some work that we do in Australia, but this is world-leading stuff. people are watching you from around the world, and I think you should be proud of that work and keep going. That's all I would say. Thank you so much for tonight. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Daniel.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, everyone.